Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to September 28th, 1864. Captain George Newman Bliss, who's pictured here, he expected a routine day in Virginia. A large cavalry force, including his troopers and the 1st Rhode Island, rode through Waynesboro in Virginia to water its horses in the Shenandoah River. Bliss rode ahead and instructed the various detachments of provost guards to keep the cavalrymen from entering private homes. All standard procedure, nothing to see here, just another day of making sure the horses, the all-important horses, are being taken care of. Well, as Bliss completed his task, a burning wood and iron railroad bridge caught his eye. It was the work of Vermont cavalrymen who had been assigned to the task. Part of the structure had already collapsed, and Bliss did just as many of us would do. He paused his horse and watched the demolition, watched the burning wood and the iron bridge collapsing. While he was engaged in watching this unfurl in front of him, gunshots interrupted the moment. Bliss's eyes followed the sound, and he spotted Confederates exchanging fire with pickets about a mile off. Bliss thought little of it as the Union forces appeared to have the upper hand. Well, they didn't. The enemy turned out in much larger force than anyone expected and rapidly gained ground. Bliss, who had seen his share of action after more than 2 years in the saddle with his regiment in the Army of the Potomac, sensed trouble. He rode over to the provost guard stationed in Waynesboro and ordered its captain to form a line and let no Union soldiers pass unless they were wounded. The captain was reluctant. He had never been in battle, had never been in combat, didn't have the experience. And so he politely asked Bliss to take over, and Bliss agreed. By this time, the Confederates had advanced close to the river. A request arrived at this time for assistance, and this came from Colonel Charles Russell Lowell, who commanded the overwhelmed picket guard. Here's an image of Lowell, well known. He would die less than a month later. So let's continue the story. Lowell was in charge of the picket as they were moving back, and Lowell, before long, shows up and arrives in front of Bliss, bringing with him bullets skittering in the road, leaving puffs of dust that drifted up and dissipated into the crisp autumn air. In a bid to gain time, Lowell and Bliss concocted a plan. They set their sights on a charge to delay the Confederates and perhaps push them back. So Lowell rounded up a squadron of troopers from the 3rd New Jersey Cavalry, known as the Butterflies for their gold-braided, elaborate hussar-styled uniforms. The Jerseymen hesitated at first, but soon they formed for a fight and charged ahead with Bliss and Lowell in the lead. Eventually, Lowell peeled off, leaving Bliss in sole command. Now, Bliss and the Butterflies flew toward the enemy horsemen, driving them back. But Bliss kept on going, realizing too late that the Jerseymen had fallen back with satisfaction at a mission they thought was accomplished. And in fact, it was. Bliss had gone too far. The Confederates filled the gap, trapping Bliss. He heard them yelling, "Kill that damned Yankee." A chase ensued through the streets of Waynesboro, and it ended when the rebels fired a shot into Bliss's mount, sending man and horse sprawling across the ground. The enemy then rode up and basically got on top of Bliss, beating him with saber blades and a carbine butt. He managed to get a few blows of his own with the saber before being compelled to surrender. He was weak from loss of blood and recovered with the help of a Confederate officer who turned out to be, like Bliss, a Mason. Now, That's the version of the story. Let me read a portion of it, the part when he gets into the fight with the Confederates, in his own words. It comes from the passage I'm going to read to you, comes from a book called Deeds of Valor, which is a go-to source for information about Civil War Medal of Honor recipients. So let me read the passage. Here's what Bliss has to say. Remember, he's under pressure and trapped by the Confederates that he had been driving back. Bliss writes, "To turn among them and retrace my steps was impossible, but my horse was swift, and I thought if I could keep on until I came to a side street, I might dash into that and, by making a circle again, reach our lines. As I rode, I kept my saber swinging, striking blows right and left. 2 of the enemy escaped by quickly dodging their heads, but I succeeded in wounding 4 of them: Captain William A. Moss, Hugh S. Hamilton, color bearer of the 4th Virginia Cavalry, and 2 others unknown to me. The first side street reached was on the left. Keeping my head close to my horse's neck, I then broke through the 3 files on my left and reached the side street in safety, fully 20 yards from the nearest horseman. For a moment, I thought I was safe, when suddenly a bullet, doubtless intended for me, struck my mount, and he staggered under the shock. With rein and spur, I urged him on, but it was in vain. He fell with a plunge that left me lying upon the ground. Before I could rise, 2 of the enemy reined in their horses by me and, leaning over in the saddles, struck at me, one with a carbine, the other with a saber. I could parry but one, and, with my saber, stopped the crushing blow from the carbine at the same instant that the saber gave me a cut across the forehead. I at once rose to my feet and shouted to the soldier who had wounded me, "For God's sake, do not kill a prisoner." "Surrender then," he said. "I do surrender," I replied, whereupon he demanded my sword and pistol, which I gave to him, and had scarcely done so when I was struck in the back with such force as to thrust me 2 steps forward. Upon turning to discover the cause of this assault, I found that the soldier had ridden up on the trot and stabbed me with his saber, which would have passed entirely through my body, but for the fact that in his ignorance of the proper use of the weapon, he had failed to make the half turn of the wrist necessary to give the saber smooth entrance between the ribs. I also saw at this moment another soldier taking aim at me with a revolver. My chances seemed gone, but a sudden impulse took possession of me, and I called for help and protection as a free Mason. Captain Henry C. Lee, the acting adjutant general of the enemy's force, heard my cry and at once came to my assistance, ordering a soldier to take me to the rear and see that my wounds were dressed. The soldier in whose charge I was despoiled me of my watch and pocketbook, and, with some assistance, being weak from loss of blood, I mounted behind my guard, and later, in the evening, I was put into an ambulance with Captain William A. Moss, at the time a lieutenant, and driven several miles to a small house in the mountains. I found Captain Moss to be a brother Mason, and he did everything possible for my comforts, although he had received a severe saber cut from me. Now here's the end of the story. Bliss gained his release from prison. Remember, he's now a prisoner of war in February of 1865. He survived the war, he survived his wounds, survived his prison experience, and went on to live a productive life as a judge in his home state back in New England. And in 1897, the federal government awarded him the Medal of Honor. He died in 1928 at age 91. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.